Why did this fighter defy every convention of aerial warfare, rewrite the rulebook, and rise to become one of the most feared machines of World War II? The answer lies with a visionary engineer who refused to follow tradition. His creation would shock the Allied forces, exceed every performance expectation, and forever reshape the design of future combat aircraft, the legendary Focke-Wulf 190. Before we uncover how it earned the name Butcher Bird, we need to look back at the beginning. By the late 1930s, Germany had already developed one of the world's most advanced and fastest fighter planes, the Messerschmitt Bf 109, a machine that symbolized the cutting edge of aviation engineering at the time. In the early stages of the war, it proved more than capable against the best fighters Britain and France had. It was a textbook example of what at the time a modern fighter was supposed to be: lightweight, streamlined, and built for high-speed dogfighting. But behind that reputation was a design philosophy that came with serious trade-offs. And not everyone in the Luftwaffe agreed. It was the right direction for the future of air combat. The Bf 109's compact airframe left little room for comfort or durability. Its cockpit was notoriously cramped and visibility was poor. Even more problematic was its narrow undercarriage, which retracted outward from the fuselage to reduce weight and drag. While this improved its top speed, it made the aircraft dangerously unstable during takeoff and landing. Around 700 German pilots, especially inexperienced ones, were killed simply trying to get the plane off the ground or land. The 109 also relied on a liquid-cooled inline engine, which made it very vulnerable. A single bullet to a coolant line could knock the engine out within seconds. That's the context in which the German Air Ministry issued a request for a second frontline fighter design, not to replace the 109, but to supplement it in case the enemy developed something better. One of the companies that responded to this request was Wolf, under the leadership of chief designer Kurt Tank. But unlike others who sought to improve on the Bf 109 speed or climb rate, Tank had an entirely different philosophy. He had served as a soldier in the First World War and understood that real combat and practice rarely matched the clean, controlled conditions of test flights. For example, in wartime, runways were usually muddy and hastily prepared. Maintenance crews were rushed and undertrained. The fighters had to keep flying and be easily and quickly repairable while also not taken out by a single bullet in the wrong place. From the beginning, the FW-190 was conceived as a robust multi-role combat aircraft, unlike the 109. It would not be built solely for dog fights and air superiority. The first major difference was Tank insisted on using an air-cooled radial engine, specifically the BMW A101, a powerful 14-cylinder unit that could withstand significant battle damage and still fly the plane back. Many experts in Europe considered radial engines outdated for frontline fighters, but Tanks saw the long-term benefit. Radials were far more tolerant of rough treatment, required less maintenance, and offered much higher survivability when hit. He also made major improvements to the aircraft's landing gear. Instead of the narrow track gear on the 109 that cost so many pilots their lives, the 190's undercarriage extended from the wings and retracted inward. This gave it a much wider stance on the ground, drastically improving stability during takeoff and landing. Another key difference was cockpit design. The Focke-Wulf gave pilots excellent visibility, thanks to its raised seating position and clear canopy. The interior was also more spacious and better organized, allowing faster training and smoother operation. These details weren't glamorous, but they reflected Tank's practical mindset. He was designing something simple and effective for war conditions that Germans often overlooked. Like with their exotic, impossible to maintain tanks and other wonder weapons. By the time the first prototype flew in 1939, it was clear that this was something completely different. Heavier than the 109, but more stable, more rugged, and more versatile. It wasn't designed to win beauty contests or set speed records, but it worked and was practical. When the FW-190 finally appeared over Western Europe in the summer of 1941, it caught the Allies completely off guard. RAF pilots, who had grown used to dog fighting the Bf-109, suddenly found themselves up against something that didn't behave the way German fighters were supposed to. It climbed quickly, rolled faster than anything they had seen before, and hit much harder than the 109. Most shocking of all, it could take massive punishment and keep fighting. Allied intelligence was so caught off guard. At first, they thought this was some repurposed French aircraft. But when they finally realized it was a new German fighter, they started to panic and even tried to organize a commando raid to capture one with its pilot to see what was actually devastating Spitfires at that point. However, something strange happened when one German pilot in his 190 got lost in bad weather. After shooting down a Spitfire, he got confused and landed on a British airfield where he and his intact fighter were captured. Giving the Allies desperately needed intelligence, the first RF aircraft to encounter the 190 in combat was Spitfire Mark Vs, which had been the biggest threat up to that point. But it now seemed that Spitfires were outclassed overnight. In terms of low to medium altitude performance, where most engagements actually took place, the 190 had the edge in almost all aspects. It had a higher roll rate, better acceleration in level flight, and superior firepower. Early 190 models were typically armed with two 7.92 mm machine guns above the engine and 420 mm cannons, 2 in the wing routes and 2 further out on the wings. This mix gave it tremendous firepower for a single-seat fighter in 1941, but would evolve into outright bizarre armament, and we'll come to that in a moment. As for the engine, the aforementioned BMW WWII, a 14-cylinder twin-row radial engine, gave it a top speed of around 410 mph at medium altitude. It had 600 horsepower with later upgrades pushing that number to over 900. The aircraft itself had a loaded weight of around 800 lb. And combined with its strong airframe and firepower, the FW-190 was exactly what its designer intended, a rugged, high-performance fighter that could be sustained in wartime conditions. It had an automatic engine management system, which controlled mixture, supercharger settings, and propeller pitch all at once. This allowed the pilot to focus on flying and fighting, not constantly adjusting engine settings in combat. But beyond just firepower and speed, the FW-190 had another major advantage that most people overlook. It was easy to fly. at least comparably to other fighters. Its controls were smooth and well balanced, and the cockpit layout made it easier for less experienced pilots to be trained faster and to be more effective in combat. That made a real difference as Germany began to rapidly lose its elite pilots, and younger, hastily trained replacements came in their place. Also, the 190 was far easier to service than the Bf 109. Again, an important thing for a country increasingly strained by bombing raids and supply shortages. But you didn't come here to listen about maintenance. You want to see it in combat, and why it got the Butcher Bird nickname. Within a year of entering service, the Focke-Wulf 190 was being modified for fighter-bomber missions, both air support and eventually interception, and even more interestingly, night interception. Upon its debut, the Fw 190 outperformed the RAF's Spitfire Mark V in several aspects, leading to a period where British pilots were advised to avoid engaging it unless necessary. This prompted the rapid development and deployment of the Spitfire Mark IX to counter the threat. However, by late 1942, the air war over Europe had entered a new phase. American heavy bombers, specifically the B-17 Flying Fortress and the Beat-24 Liberator, were beginning to arrive in greater numbers, and the Allied bombing campaign intensified. Bombers were designed to defend themselves with overlapping fields of fire, flying in tight formations and bristling with up to 1350 caliber machine guns each. At the same time, the pace and scale of Allied bombing raids were increasing rapidly, with British bombing by night and Americans by day. Now, wait till we get to night fighting. The German Bf 109, while capable of intercepting bombers, was not ideal for this type of mission. It had a lighter armament and was vulnerable to bombers' machine guns. The Focke-Wulf 190, on the other hand, could take more punishment, and it carried heavier armament by default, which were much more suitable for such big targets. Very soon, the Luftwaffe began adapting the Focke 190 into a dedicated bomber interceptor. Specialized variants received additional armor, plating to protect the pilot, and external hardpoints for mounting heavier weaponry. Some carried 20 or even 30 mm cannons, now mounted under the wings. These modifications significantly increased the aircraft's firepower, but at the heavy cost of speed and maneuverability. In addition to conventional gun upgrades, German engineers introduced more experimental solutions. Starting in 1943, selected 190s were equipped with air-to-air rockets. They usually carried one 21 cm rocket tube under each wing. Rockets were wildly inaccurate and created significant drag, but when fired into the middle of a bomber formation, they caused disruption and heavy damage to multiple bombers with fragmentation. These rockets were first used in significant numbers during the infamous second raid on Schweinfurt on October 14th. That day, the rocket-equipped fighters contributed to what would become the deadliest day for American bomber crews during the entire war, when they lost 60 bombers and suffered hundreds of casualties among their crews. The disruption caused by the rockets allowed other fighters to move in and inflict even more damage. However, this success was short-lived. In 1944, the introduction of long-range Allied escort fighters, particularly the P-51 Mustang, changed the balance. These new escorts could accompany bombers deep into German territory and engage interceptors directly. The rocket-equipped 190s, already burdened by drag and reduced performance, became increasingly vulnerable. Although the rocket tubes could be jettisoned after use, this rarely provided enough time to evade escort fighters. And yet, even that wasn't the most unconventional role the FW-190 would be forced to play. That would come at night. British bombers suffered far fewer losses than Americans bombing by day. The Luftwaffe's dedicated night fighters like the Bf 110 were few in number and required precise coordination with ground radar stations. So in a desperate move, the Germans tried sending single-seat 190s into the night skies with no radar, no ground control, and no support. The idea became known as wild boar. Their job was to patrol over German cities during bombing raids and use the light from fires, explosions, and searchlights to spot enemy bombers visually. Once they had a visual fix, they would pursue and engage, flying through flak bursts from their own anti-aircraft batteries. Many pilots never came back, but this rule-breaking tactic became a key part of Germany's night defense in 1943 and brought down quite a number of bombers. However, as the RAF improved their own radar, jamming and route planning, and as flak zones grew more dangerous for everyone involved, night interception returned to larger, two-seat aircraft better suited for the role. We also have to mention Georg Peter Eder, one of the most effective bomber interceptors of the entire war. Eder began flying the FW-190 in late 1942, just as the bomber raids were intensifying. Together with fellow ace Egon Meyer, he developed a tactic that would become infamous among Allied bomber crews: the head-on attack. Instead of coming in from behind, as was the usual approach, they would fly directly at the bomber formation from the front at high speed, fire a burst, and veer off just before collision. It was incredibly dangerous, but it was also devastatingly effective. The front of a B-17 or B-24 had fewer guns, and a single well-placed burst could kill the pilots or damage the cockpit and controls. Decades after the war, one crashed WU-190 would be found. But upon close inspection, something bizarre would be revealed. Paul Ratz was flying his Focke-Wulf near Leningrad in 1943 and had just finished a low-level attack on a train when his engine suddenly failed mid-flight. With no other option, he crash-landed the aircraft in the soft, swampy terrain and began walking west. Eventually, he was captured by Soviet forces and remained a prisoner until the war ended. The crash site was deep in the wilderness, and the marshland preserved the wreckage remarkably well. For more than 4 decades, the FW-190 sat untouched until it was finally rediscovered in 1989. To the shock of the recovery team, the plane was largely intact like a time capsule. It was transported to the United States, where a team of restorers began the painstaking process of bringing the aircraft back to life. But when the team began disassembling the engine, something unusual caught their attention. One of the fuel lines was completely blocked, not by corrosion or time, but by a rag stuffed deep inside. The cause of the crash was not a mechanical failure. It was sabotage, and it was not an isolated case. During the war, the German aircraft industry relied heavily on forced labor, including prisoners from occupied countries, concentration camps, and labor camps. Many of them were put to work in factories, assembling engines under armed guard. Sabotaging an aircraft was one of the few quiet acts of defiance available to them. They understood that something as small as a misplaced wrench, a snipped wire, or a rag tucked into a fuel line could be enough to cost the Luftwaffe a precious fighter. In the case of the WWII 190, pulled from the marsh, that silent resistance succeeded. The engine failed soon after takeoff, forcing pilot Rats into a crash landing that he barely survived. Whether he ever discovered the true reason behind the failure remains uncertain. Many years later, following a painstaking restoration process, the aircraft took to the skies once again in 2011, its original BMW 801 radial engine roaring back to life.